A quiet afternoon in the peaceful neighborhood of Maple Grove turned into the scene of a career-ending mistake when a veteran police officer handcuffed the most powerful woman in the department. He saw a black woman jogging and let his bias guide him instead of the law. What he didn't know was that one snap of the handcuffs would unravel everything, right in front of the entire neighborhood. The Pennsylvania sun sat high in the sky, casting clean golden light over the quiet suburban streets of Maple Grove. It was the kind of neighborhood where the lawns were edged to perfection, American flags fluttered from porches, and the only real noise came from sprinklers clicking rhythmically against rose bushes. Maple Grove didn't see much action. It didn't need to. It wore its quiet like a badge of pride. Lieutenant Frank Darrow cruised slowly through the neighborhood in his black and white, one hand on the steering wheel, the other draped lazily over the windowsill. 25 years in the force, and this was where he'd landed, patrolling the safer parts of town, a position he viewed less as a demotion and more as a necessary guard post. He'd always told himself that good policing wasn't about adrenaline or shootouts. It was about watching. It was about knowing when something, or someone, didn't belong. And on that quiet street, Frank spotted what he instinctively considered out of place. A black woman. Mid to late 40s. Lean build, athletic, moving at a steady jog along the sidewalk. She had wireless earbuds in and wore sleek running gear that looked expensive, right down to the compression sleeves hugging her calves and the GPS watch tracking her pace. She didn't glance at him. Most people gave a cruiser at least a quick look. A nod. Some acknowledgement. She didn't even break stride. And as she passed a driveway with a brand new BMW parked outside, a vehicle he knew belonged to a white couple on vacation, Frank's gaze narrowed. Where'd she come from? Had she just jogged past? Had she stepped out from between the houses? Was she casing the place? His gut tingled. The kind of tingle that 25 years on the job had taught him to trust. Or maybe it wasn't trust. Maybe it was habit. He rolled the cruiser to a stop at the curb, tires crunching lightly against the gravel. No siren. No lights. Just enough to make his presence known. He stepped out, adjusted his belt, letting the weight of his badge and sidearm hang heavy, and called out to her, not with a shout, but with that low, measured voice police officers perfect over years of command and compliance. Afternoon, he said. She slowed, then stopped, tugging out one earbud. Her breathing was elevated but controlled. She was sweating, sure, but didn't look flustered in the least. Her eyes flicked to his belt, then back to his face. Not startled. Not intimidated. Just steady. Something wrong, officer, she asked, her tone calm, respectful, but not deferential. Where you coming from? Frank asked, folding his arms. She blinked once, slowly, then glanced up the street. My house, she replied. Just finishing a run. Where's that exactly? 2 blocks that way, she said, jerking her thumb over her shoulder. Corner of Linden and Maple. Frank nodded slowly, like he was considering her answer, weighing it against something he couldn't quite define. You got ID on you? That was the shift. Subtle but clear. Her posture, while still composed, stiffened ever so slightly. The softness in her shoulders vanished. Her chin lifted a touch. Her breath drew in deeper. No, she said. Didn't bring one. Just out for a run. You're telling me you're jogging through this neighborhood with no ID? I'm telling you I live in this neighborhood and I don't carry ID when I run. Her tone hadn't changed, but the edge was visible now. Not disrespectful. Just resolute. Frank tilted his head. He didn't like being questioned. He never had. In his mind, compliance was safety. Questions were friction. Friction made things dangerous. He took a small step forward. Just need to make sure everything checks out, he said. Can't be too careful these days. She put both hands on her hips and looked him directly in the eyes. Careful of what? He didn't answer right away. His jaw tightened. Had a few break-ins around here lately. You jogged past a high-end car. Just doing my job. So jogging past a car is cause for suspicion, she said, half laughing. Is that the official policy now? Frank took another step forward. Ma'am, I'm not going to ask again. I need to see some identification. She didn't move. Just stood her ground. You can ask all you want. But unless I'm being lawfully detained, I'm going to continue my run. That did it. Frank didn't think. He reacted. In one motion, he reached for her wrist. She flinched, instinctively trying to pull back, but it was too late. His grip locked around her arm, twisting it behind her as his other hand brought out the cuffs. She struggled, yelling, "What are you doing?" But Frank had already shifted into procedure. You're under arrest for obstruction of an investigation. What investigation? She barked. You're making a huge mistake. Stop resisting, he snapped, tightening the cuffs. They clicked around her wrists, glinting in the sun. Around them, the sleepy neighborhood stirred. A door creaked open across the street. Someone stepped onto their porch. A woman paused at her mailbox, phone already in hand, camera lens up. The woman Frank had just arrested looked at him, her expression a mix of disbelief and fury. You have no idea who I am. I don't need to, Frank replied, pulling out his radio. Dispatch, I've got a 10 to 15. Female. Refusing to provide ID. Requesting transport. That's when the man appeared. Well-dressed. Mid-50s. Deep brown suit, open collar. Jamal Bennett had a calmness to him, the kind that commanded attention without demanding it. He walked over, not with aggression, but with purpose. And when he spoke, the entire street seemed to hush. Excuse me, officer, he said, voice low. What's going on here? Frank didn't flinch. Sir, please stay back. I'm conducting an investigation. That woman you've got in cuffs, Jamal said, nodding toward her. What's the charge? She refused to identify herself when asked. She wasn't required to, Jamal said, his voice sharpening. Jogging in daylight isn't a crime. Frank's mouth opened to respond, but then the SUV pulled up. Black. Tinted windows. No plates. The kind of vehicle you didn't question unless you wanted problems. The door opened. Out stepped Deputy Chief Marissa Vaughn. And she did not look pleased. Frank straightened instinctively. Marissa barely looked at him as she walked toward the scene. Her eyes scanned the cuffs, then the woman in them. And when they locked gazes, the truth hit her like a gut punch. Alana, she asked. The cuffed woman nodded. Yes, ma'am. Marissa turned on Frank like a hurricane. Uncuff her. Now. Chief. That's an order, Lieutenant. The blood drained from Frank's face. She refused to identify herself. Because she didn't have to, Marissa snapped. This is Chief Alana Pierce, head of the county department. Your boss. The silence was deafening. The woman in cuffs, whose arms Frank had twisted, whose identity he'd questioned, whose existence he treated like a threat, was the one person who outranked everyone in a 50-mile radius. Frank's hands fumbled as he unlocked the cuffs. Alana rubbed her wrists, red lines burning into her skin. Her expression was unreadable. Controlled. But her eyes were fire. She stepped forward, close enough that only Frank could hear her. You don't even realize how dangerous you are. And Frank, Lieutenant Frank Darrow, who had once believed in his instincts above all else, stood still in the middle of a sunlit street, surrounded by cameras, neighbors, and the weight of a mistake he'd never be able to unmake. And he hadn't even seen the worst of it yet. Frank's fingers hovered near his radio, the weight of his mistake not yet fully realized, though something deep in his gut began to turn. Chief. She had said chief. But no, he shook it off, clung to the routine, to the authority that had always carried him through uncertainty. Dispatch, he said, voice low, controlled, I've got a 10 to 15, female subject refusing to identify. Requesting transport at my location. He was still holding on to procedure like it could save him. But already, eyes were watching. Across the street, phone stayed raised. The woman by her mailbox hadn't looked away once. Another man stood on his porch now, arms folded, lips tight, recording. Dr. Alana Pierce stood in silence, breathing slow through her nose, her arms behind her back, the metal cuffs digging into her wrists. She didn't struggle. She didn't plead. She didn't panic. She simply stared straight ahead, eyes fixed on the horizon like she had seen this before, survived it before, and wasn't about to break now. Frank barely had time to process the murmurs beginning to build around him when a voice cut clean through the noise. "Officer, what is happening here?" A man approached from down the sidewalk, mid-50s, dark tailored suit, polished shoes that didn't match the suburban stroll. There was something deliberate in his stride, the quiet kind of confidence that doesn't ask for attention but commands it anyway. Frank turned, already bristling. "Sir, please step back. This is a police matter." But the man didn't flinch. "That woman," he said, pointing to Alana, "what's the charge?" Frank's jaw tensed. "Obstruction." She refused to provide ID when asked. "I had reason to investigate." The man's brow furrowed. "You detained a woman in broad daylight for jogging?" "She was acting suspicious," Frank insisted. "I made a judgment call." "A judgment call," the man repeated slowly, his voice heavy with disapproval. "My name is Jamal Bennett. I live 3 houses down. I've seen her jogging here every morning for the last 3 weeks. Frank shifted, a chill crawling under his collar. That doesn't change the fact that she refused to cooperate with an investigation. Jamal shook his head slowly. Or maybe she didn't feel the need to prove she belonged here. Before Frank could respond, the low hum of tires on pavement caught everyone's attention. A black SUV pulled up silently to the curb, sleek, unmarked, windows tinted dark. It was the kind of vehicle that didn't belong in a neighborhood like Maple Grove. The kind that didn't need lights or sirens to make people pay attention. The back door opened and out stepped a woman in a sharply cut uniform. Short, cropped hair. Authority in every inch of her stance. Her eyes scanned the scene once, and they locked immediately on the cuffs around Alana Pierce's wrists. Frank recognized her instantly. Deputy Chief Marissa Vaughn. His superior. His direct report. And she looked like a storm ready to break. "Lieutenant Darrow," she said, voice sharp and precise. "What the hell am I looking at?" Frank straightened reflexively. "Deputy Chief, ma'am, I was responding to suspicious activity." "This individual refused to provide ID. Uncuff her," Marissa said, cutting him off like a blade. Frank blinked. "Ma'am, now," she barked. "You're this close to obstruction yourself." There was a weight to her tone that silenced everything else. Frank's hands moved on instinct, keys fumbling as he unlocked the cuffs. Alana rolled her wrists, the red marks glaring in the sunlight. She didn't speak. Not yet. Jamal stepped forward. "Thank you," he said to Marissa, his tone curt. "This never should have happened." Marissa nodded once, then turned back to Frank. "Do you know who this is?" Frank's mouth opened, but he couldn't find the words. "That's Chief Alana Pierce," Marissa said, her voice rising just enough for the neighbors to hear. "The head of the county's entire law enforcement division. Your boss's boss. The person you just detained, cuffed, and treated like a suspect because she was black and jogging." The words hit Frank harder than any fist. A ripple of disbelief spread through the onlookers. Phones zoomed in. One man gasped. Another woman whispered, "Oh my God, he cuffed the chief?" Frank felt his throat tighten. "I didn't know," he said weakly. "She didn't identify, she didn't have to," Marissa snapped. "You had no probable cause. You had no complaint. You had your bias and your badge, and you thought that was enough." Alana finally stepped forward, her voice calm and measured but sharp as glass. You saw a black woman jogging and assumed I didn't belong. You decided I was a threat to this neighborhood, to this car in a driveway, to your sense of control. And without any real reason, you laid your hands on me." Frank tried to hold her gaze, but his eyes dropped. "You had no idea who I was," Alana continued. "And that's the point, isn't it? Because in your mind, it didn't matter. All you needed to see was a woman who didn't look like she fit." Marissa stood beside her, arms folded. "You're lucky she's not pressing charges. But I'll be handling this. And so will internal affairs." Frank felt like the ground was shifting under his feet. The badge on his chest felt heavier now, suffocating instead of empowering. Around him, the neighborhood he thought he was protecting stood in silent judgment. Effective immediately, Marissa said coldly, "You are relieved of duty. Badge and weapon. Now." Frank hesitated. Then, with trembling hands, he unclipped his badge, placed it gently in Marissa's outstretched palm, and slowly removed his firearm. He couldn't look at anyone. Not at Alana. Not at Marissa. Not at the bystanders who had just watched a career unravel in real time. Alana didn't gloat. She didn't raise her voice. She simply turned to him, quiet steel in her tone. "I hope this moment teaches you something. Because for people like me, this moment isn't rare. It's reality." And with that, she turned and walked back toward the SUV. The camera phones followed her, some recording, some live streaming, all capturing the image of power reclaimed without force. Marissa followed closely behind. Before stepping into the vehicle, she looked back at Frank one last time. "You need to think long and hard about who you are behind that badge," she said. "Because today, we all saw it clearly." The SUV pulled away, leaving behind silence so thick it felt physical. Frank stood on the curb, hands empty, watching the street he thought he knew change before his eyes. For the first time in 25 years, he wasn't sure if he had ever understood justice, or if he'd simply misunderstood his role in it all along. Lieutenant Frank Darrow stood on the sidewalk of Maple Grove, his badge and sidearm gone, his authority stripped not by force, but by truth. The black SUV that carried Chief Alana Pierce and Deputy Chief Marissa Vaughn had just disappeared around the bend, yet its shadow seemed to stretch long across the neighborhood, casting a darkness Frank could feel in his chest. The air had shifted, he could taste it, like iron and ash. Around him, the neighborhood he had sworn to protect no longer looked the same. The hedges still trimmed. Lawn still perfect. But the eyes, those eyes staring out from porches and behind phones, were no longer admiring. They were watching him. Judging him. Disappointed by him. And the worst part? He couldn't blame them. For the first time in his career, Frank felt like he didn't belong here either. He climbed back into his cruiser for now, anyway, and shut the door behind him. The silence inside was suffocating. No radio chatter. No partner. Just the echo of his own breath, and the sound of his gloves creaking as he flexed his hands unconsciously, fingers still remembering the way they had clamped the cuffs around her wrists. His knuckles ached. His stomach turned. He leaned forward, resting his forehead against the steering wheel. The sun was hot through the windshield, but he was cold. Hollow. He had been trained to trust his instincts. To react quickly. To control a situation before it could control him. That's what they taught at the academy. That's what earned him promotions. That's what kept him alive through 25 years of stops, confrontations, late-night calls. He had built an entire identity around the idea that his judgment was sound. But today, that foundation cracked. And through the cracks, something ugly seeped out. Because today, his judgment had been wrong. Not just about what she was doing or where she was going, but about who she was. About what she represented. About why she unsettled him in the first place. Frank lifted his head, staring out at the same street he had patrolled for years. It looked the same, but nothing felt familiar anymore. That woman, Chief Alana Pierce, hadn't needed to raise her voice. She hadn't needed to pull rank. Her presence alone had exposed something in him that he had never wanted to confront. The assumption that someone didn't belong, not because of anything they did, but because of how they looked, and how they moved, and how they didn't make room for him when he passed by in a patrol car. And what if she hadn't been the chief? What if she had been someone else? Someone without a badge or title? Someone with no camera phone witness, no commanding officer to arrive in a black SUV? Would she still be in cuffs right now, riding in the back of a squad car towards central booking? Would anyone have even cared? Frank swallowed hard. His mouth was dry. He reached for the water bottle and the cup holder, but his hand shook. He set it back down. Memories started surfacing. Not the kind you're proud of, the other kind. That traffic stop on Cedar Avenue last year, he'd pulled over a young man in a hoodie because he fit the description. The call he answered near the elementary school, a woman waiting in a car with out-of-state plates that didn't look right. The teenager at the bus stop he had questioned for standing still too long. He had always justified those moments. Told himself he was being vigilant, observant, protective. But now, he wasn't so sure anymore. Chief Pierce's words echoed in his head. You saw a black woman jogging and assumed I didn't belong. He had thought she was being dramatic, that she was making it about race when it wasn't. But wasn't it? He hadn't asked anyone else for ID that day. He hadn't stopped the man walking his dog or the woman pushing a stroller. He had only stopped her. He looked down at the dashcam still recording, the clock still ticking in the corner of the screen. He reached up and turned it off. What was left to record now? As he sat there, motionless, another squad car passed slowly down the road. The officer behind the wheel glanced at him but didn't stop. Didn't wave. Didn't acknowledge him at all. Word had already spread. Frank leaned back, resting his head against the seat. The silence wasn't empty anymore, it was loud, crashing, punishing. It wasn't the loss of his badge that gutted him. It wasn't even the suspension. It was the realization that everything he had told himself about being fair, about being just, about treating everyone the same, it had all been built on sand. His intentions might have felt neutral, but his actions weren't. And actions were what counted. He thought of her again. The way she had stood there, shoulders square, even in handcuffs. The way she had spoken, not with anger, but with truth. The way she hadn't needed to say, I outrank you, to hold power in that moment. And that final look she gave him, piercing, not cruel. Pitying. She had been through this before. Maybe not exactly like this. But close enough. You could see it in the way she carried herself. In the way she spoke not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been mistaken for a threat while simply existing. Frank reached for his notebook. Not the incident log. His personal one. The one where he used to jot thoughts after tough calls. He hadn't touched it in months. Years, maybe. He opened it, hesitated, then began writing. April 10th. I cuffed the chief of police today. The pen hovered. Not because she broke the law. Not because she resisted. But because I didn't recognize her. And worse, I didn't believe she belonged. He stopped. Closed the book. Stared out the windshield again. It wasn't enough. Nothing he could write or say would undo what happened. But maybe admitting it, even just to himself, was a start. Maybe this was the moment where he stopped pretending he was immune to the problem and started figuring out how he had become part of it. The cruiser's radio crackled faintly with chatter from another unit. A burglary call in the next town over. A domestic dispute down the highway. The world was still moving. Cops were still working. But Frank sat still, suspended not just from duty, but from certainty. He didn't know if he'd get his badge back. He didn't know if he deserved to. He thought about the next officer who saw someone like Alana jogging. Would they remember this moment? Would they ask questions instead of drawing conclusions? Would they see a neighbor instead of a threat? And what about the people without titles, without a camera rolling, without someone pulling up to say, Uncuff her now. How many of them had stories like this, but with worse endings? Frank didn't have answers. Not yet. But the questions were loud. And for the first time, he wasn't pushing them away. As the sun dipped lower in the sky and the shadows of Maple Grove lengthened across the sidewalks, Lieutenant Frank Darrow sat alone, stripped of the certainty he once wore like armor. And in its place was something heavier, but maybe more honest: doubt, reflection, and a need to reckon with the truth. Because today, he hadn't just made a mistake. He had exposed something broken. In himself. In his training. In the system he swore to serve. And the real question now was simple. When will it stop? And who's willing to make sure it does? What happened in Maple Grove is a powerful reminder that injustice doesn't always come wearing a ski mask or carrying a weapon. Sometimes it wears a uniform, carries a badge, and hides behind words like suspicion or procedure. Lieutenant Frank Darrow didn't wake up intending to abuse his authority. But good intentions mean little when they're clouded by unchecked bias. His decision to handcuff a woman who was simply jogging, a woman who not only lived in that neighborhood but led its police department, wasn't just a personal failure. It was a symptom of a broader, deeper problem. The real danger lies in assumptions. When we allow fear or stereotypes to guide our instincts, we open the door to actions that hurt innocent people, people who don't have a title to protect them. Dr. Alana Pierce stood her ground not because she had power, but because she knew who she was. But what if she hadn't been the chief? Would anyone have listened? Would anyone have believed her? That's the question we must ask ourselves. Because for every story like Alana's, there are countless others who didn't have a camera filming, who didn't have a superior officer arriving in time, who didn't have a second chance. And it's not enough to say, well, that's just how the system works. If the system punishes people for existing while black, brown, poor, or simply unfamiliar, then the system isn't broken, it's working exactly as it was designed. And that's what must change. If you wear a badge, carry a gun, or hold any position of power, this story is your mirror. Look into it honestly. Ask yourself hard questions. Because real justice doesn't start with the courts, it starts on the sidewalk, in the patrol car, at the moment of decision. Real justice begins with how we see each other. And to you, the listener, thank you. Thank you for choosing to be part of a community that values truth, accountability, and growth. Here on U.S. Justice Story, we believe storytelling is a tool for transformation. If this story moved you, challenged you, or opened your eyes in some way, please share it. Have conversations. Ask questions. And never underestimate your voice. Because justice isn't just a destination, it's a daily decision. And change begins with awareness. Stay safe, stay conscious, and as always, thank you for listening.